As noted in the previous lecture, the rapid process of decolonization after the end of World War II created a need to think about development as a project. Remember also at that time, the Soviet model of economic development was perceived as a viable, indeed an attractive alternative to American capitalism. Given the desire of the United States to court allies among the newly emerging developing countries, it was essential for the United States to be able to articulate a model of economic development. This void was filled by modernization theory, and the importance of providing a model of development in the context of the Cold War was articulated by W. Rostow, considered the founder of modernization theory, in his classic text, The Stages of Economic Growth. Rostow subtitled his book A Non-Communist Manifesto, signaling his understanding of the importance of the broader Cold War context in development thinking. Rostow argued that it is possible to identify all societies in their economic dimensions as lying within one of 5 categories: the traditional society, the preconditions for takeoff, the drive to maturity, and the age of high mass consumption. When independent modern nationhood is achieved, how should the national energies be disposed? In external aggression, to right old wrongs, or to exploit newly created or perceived possibilities for enlarging national power? In completing and in refining the political victory of the new national government over old regional interests, or in modernizing the economy? Rostow thus believed it was possible to classify countries along a broad spectrum of development, with every country moving from one discrete stage to the next. Aiding development thus meant facilitating the transition from one stage to the next. The first stage of development was that of traditional society, which was defined by reliance on kinship or family-based power structures, had an economy based primarily on agriculture and largely subsistence agriculture, and relied little on science or technology, and instead had social beliefs centering on mythology. Finally, because there was little economic activity, there was little economic surplus for savings or investment. Gradually, though, countries would enter the second stage of development, in which the preconditions for more rapid growth, something Rostow called takeoff, were established. During this phase, several important changes took place to traditional societies. New groups started to emerge, particularly those focused on entrepreneurial activities, and these groups pushed for change both socially and economically. At some point, society would reach a tipping point. For Rostow, this tipping point was takeoff, a phase in which the preconditions for rapid economic growth had been achieved, and society began a rapid period of economic and social development. During this phase, dramatic transitions took place across most sectors of society. Political authority was centralized into a modern state, and the goal of that state was to promote economic growth. The economy moved away from extensive reliance on subsistence agriculture, broadening the economic base and promoting emergent industrial activities. Urbanization commenced. Birth rates also started to decline, reflecting broader social reorganization. After takeoff, development begins to slow as society matures. Economic growth becomes more generalized, as there is widespread reinvestment across a wide array of activities and industries in the economy, as it diversifies. International trade also expands, as does reliance on technology in the sphere of economic production. Finally, society reaches the pinnacle of economic development, a phase Rostow labeled as mass production for mass consumption. This level of economic development mirrored the United States in the 1960s, with widespread production of consumer goods for domestic consumption, a continuous increase in real income for most people, and an expansion of state delivery of social welfare and security goods. Put another way, modernization theory posited that all countries exist along various points of a similar developmental path. Countries like Afghanistan are still in the traditional society category. Others, like India, are in takeoff, while still others, like Japan, have reached the pinnacle of development. From the perspective of modernization theory, every country fell along the same developmental spectrum. The challenge of post-war development project then was to figure out how to speed countries along the developmental path. But implicit in this theory was the suggestion that, even barring intervention, all countries would eventually move along the same developmental path. The United States, in other words, is the future of Somalia. It's just that Somalia is currently very far behind. Modernization theory represented the primary school of developmental thought in the West, but the school was not without its critics. Emerging from the work of Latin American theorists in the 1960s, dependency theory was particularly interesting because it represented the first broad theory of development indigenous to the global South. Dependency theorists like Emanuel Wallerstein and Andre Gunder Frank argued that modernization theory was built on a faulty premise. In assuming that all countries moved along a similar developmental trajectory, dependency theorists contended that modernization theory was leaving out an important historical period, namely colonialism. Dependency theorists argued that while First World may have been at one point undeveloped, it was never underdeveloped. That is, dependency theorists argued that the development that occurred in the First World was conditioned on the extraction of resources from the colonies in the Third World. This process, which they termed underdevelopment, was never experienced by the First World. Consequently, First World and Third World development had fundamentally different, indeed irreconcilable, starting points. As Andre Gunder Frank, one of the leading dependency theorists, put it, economic development and underdevelopment are opposite faces of the same coin. They are both the necessary result and contemporary manifestations of internal contradictions in the world capitalist system. The historical development of the capitalist system have generated underdevelopment in the peripheral satellites, whose economic surplus was expropriated, while it generated economic development in the metropolitan centers, which appropriate that surplus. Modernization and dependency theories presented two fundamentally different understandings, both of the nature of the global system, the role of the state, and the nature of economic development. For modernization theorists, the challenges of development are primarily rooted in the internal dynamics of the country. Inappropriate economic and political structures, backwards technologies, outmoded beliefs, and so on. Closer ties to the global system, particularly the global economy, could thus help to facilitate development by overcoming these traditional barriers. By contrast, dependency theorists believed that the challenge of development was actually rooted in the connections between the underdeveloped South and the overdeveloped North. Development, they contended, could only be achieved by breaking ties with the global economy and by looking inward, a process Samir Amin termed de-linking. But in spite of the differences, both modernization and dependency theories had an understanding of development that was fundamentally the same. Both conceived of development as a progressive and linear process defined primarily in terms of economic growth and restructuring. By the 1970s, a whole host of new theories of development were beginning to emerge, each drawing attention to a slightly different problem facing the global South, but most still rooted fundamentally in the problem of establishing and maintaining economic growth. These theories, arising in the context of the 1970s crisis of stagflation, which we'll discuss next week, tended to bring into consideration a broader array of issues, including basic needs and poverty, environmental questions, and gender dynamics. We'll return to all of these later in the course. For now, it's sufficient to note the evolving thinking taking place around the question of development. More recent development theory has tended to focus on questions of representation and inclusion. Development has been critiqued as a totalizing discourse, operating on the assumption that it is basically or equally applicable around the world and obviating local specificities and conditions. What works in Bangladesh should work the same way in Uganda or Senegal. Others have questioned the relevance of development more broadly. Indeed, Arturo Escobar proclaimed the death of development, suggesting that the concept itself is outmoded and no longer useful. In his introduction to the Development Dictionary, Wolfgang Sachs argues that the idea of development stands like a ruin on the intellectual landscape. Delusion and disappointment, failures and crimes have been the steady companions of development, and they tell a common story. It did not work. Moreover, the historical conditions which catapulted the idea into prominence have vanished. Development has become outdated. But above all, the hopes and desires which made the idea fly are now exhausted. Development has grown obsolete. But proclamations of the death of development are, to borrow a very famous phrase, vastly overstated. Development remains a central question in the global political economy, even if we can't come to clear agreement on what precisely we mean or how to achieve it. It also remains a central component of state legitimacy in the developing world, as we'll discuss in the next lecture.